Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of South Carolina. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. The year was 1847, when the Whitmore Plantation stood among the moss-draped oaks of Beaufort County, its white columns gleaming in the oppressive summer heat. When Cornelius Whitmore returned from the Charleston slave market with his latest acquisition, his wife Catherine found herself unable to look away from the towering figure who emerged from the wagon. The man, who would be recorded in the plantation ledgers simply as Samuel, stood nearly 7 feet tall, his massive frame dwarfing even the overseer. What disturbed Catherine most was not his size, but the calculated way his eyes surveyed the property. She could not have known that this man possessed skills honed in the dense forests of his homeland, skills that would transform the Whitmore Plantation into the site of one of the most chilling mysteries ever documented in the antebellum South. The plantation overseer, Jacob Hastings, a man who had supervised over 300 enslaved workers across various estates in his 15-year career, wrote in his daily log dated August 12, 1847, that Samuel was unlike any slave he had previously encountered. The entry, discovered in 1978, among documents donated to the South Carolina Historical Society, noted that Samuel possessed an unsettling calm and refused to lower his gaze when addressed, behaviors that would typically result in immediate and severe punishment. Even more peculiar was the entry in the plantation's account ledger, showing that Cornelius had paid the extraordinary sum of $2,000 for Samuel's purchase, a price nearly 4 times the market value for even the most skilled field worker. Catherine's personal correspondence to her cousin in Charleston, dated August 15th and found tucked inside a family Bible in 1952, mentioned her unease at her husband's secretive behavior regarding the new arrival and her observation that Samuel moved through the quarters with the bearing of a man who had never truly been broken. Samuel was assigned to the timber sections of the Whitmore Plantation, a dense area of pine and cypress that stretched along the eastern border of the property, nearly 2 miles from the main house. According to work assignments recorded in the plantation ledgers, this placement was unusual, given that newly acquired slaves were typically kept closer to the overseer's watchful eye during their initial months. Ruth Williams, an elderly enslaved woman who served as the plantation cook, provided testimony in 1891 to her granddaughter, an account preserved through oral history and later transcribed by a researcher from Fisk University in 1934, stating that other workers began reporting strange occurrences within Samuel's first week at the timber site. The men who worked alongside him told Ruth that Samuel would vanish into the depths of the forest for hours at a time, leaving his assigned tasks unfinished, yet somehow the required amount of timber would always appear at the collection point by day's end. When Samuel returned from these mysterious absences, his clothing bore peculiar marks that the other workers could not explain, scratches and stains that seemed deliberate rather than accidental, patterns that reminded some of the older workers of tribal markings they had seen in their youth before. The Middle Passage had stolen them from their homelands. A letter dated September 23, 1847, written by Harold Pemberton, owner of the adjacent Rosewood Plantation, to his brother in Savannah, and discovered during an estate auction in 1923, described hearing unusual sounds emanating from the Whitmore property during the late evening hours. Pemberton wrote that these sounds resembled animal calls, yet were unlike any wildlife native to South Carolina, describing them as a mixture of bird cries and something altogether more unsettling, sounds that caused his own slaves to refuse evening work near the property line and made his hunting dogs cower in their kennels. On the evening of September 28, 1847, Jacob Hastings left the main house following his customary inspection of the day's work assignments, informing the house staff that he intended to conduct his usual rounds of the property's perimeter before retiring to his cabin. When dawn broke the following morning, and Hastings had not appeared for the distribution of the day's assignments, a search was initiated that would continue for 3 days without result. A brief notice appeared in the Beaufort Gazette, dated October 1st, 1847, reporting that Jacob Hastings, overseer of the Whitmore plantation, was missing and presumed to have drowned in the nearby Combahee River, a conclusion the newspaper attributed to statements made by Cornelius Whitmore himself. The notice mentioned that Hastings' horse had been found wandering near the river's edge with its saddle askew, suggesting the overseer had taken a fall during his evening rounds. Despite extensive searches conducted by local men along the riverbanks and neighboring properties, Hastings' body was never recovered, a fact that the newspaper attributed to the strong currents and alligator population known to inhabit those waters. Within 4 days of the disappearance, Cornelius Whitmore had hired a replacement overseer, Martin Crenshaw, a man formerly employed at a plantation in Georgia, who came with adequate references but little personal history. Catherine Whitmore's diary entry dated October 3rd, 1847, discovered in 1967 when her great-granddaughter donated family documents to the Charleston Historical Society, revealed her profound unease at her husband's reaction to the tragedy. The entry noted that Cornelius displayed a strange lack of concern over Hastings' disappearance, refusing to discuss the matter beyond brief remarks and showing more interest in ensuring that Crenshaw understood the particular importance of avoiding the timber sections after dusk, an instruction that Catherine found both specific and deeply troubling, given the circumstances of the previous overseer's fate. Catherine Whitmore began a practice of observing the plantation's daily operations from her second-floor bedroom window, a vantage point that provided an unobstructed view of the workers' movements between the fields and the distant timber sections. Her diary entries from October through November 1847, preserved among the family documents donated to the Charleston Historical Society, reveal a growing fascination with Samuel's distinctive manner of movement. She wrote on October 15th that Samuel moved through the landscape with what she described as a predatory grace, noting that while other workers trudged with the exhaustion of their labor, Samuel seemed to glide across the ground with an economy of motion that reminded her of the panthers she had once seen in a traveling menagerie. The entry dated October 22nd describes her decision to question Cornelius directly about Samuel's origins, a conversation that took place in her husband's study following the evening meal. According to Catherine's account, Cornelius became visibly irritated by her inquiries and dismissed her questions with curt responses, stating only that Samuel had been acquired from a specialized trading post in Savannah that dealt in acquisitions from West Africa, men who possessed particular skills that made them valuable for specific types of labor. When Catherine pressed for additional details, noting the extraordinary price recorded in the ledgers, Cornelius reportedly told her that matters of business were beyond her concern and that she should occupy herself with household management rather than the origins of field workers. A shipping manifest examination conducted in 2003 by doctoral student Marcus Reeves at the College of Charleston, documented in his dissertation on irregular slave trade practices, revealed no record of any individual matching Samuel's description arriving at Savannah's port facilities during 1846 or 1847, raising questions about how Samuel had actually come into Cornelius Whitmore's possession and suggesting that the circumstances of his acquisition may have involved channels outside the conventional slave market systems of that era. The pattern of disappearances that would later become the subject of intense scrutiny began to establish itself during the months of November and December 1847. On November 18th, a slave driver named William Thatcher, a man known throughout the plantation for his particular cruelty in administering punishments, failed to appear for the morning assembly. Plantation records examined by researchers in 1989 show that Thatcher was officially listed as a runaway, despite the improbability of a white employee fleeing from a profitable position and the fact that none of his personal belongings or wages were missing from his quarters. Less than 3 weeks later, on December 6th, a traveling merchant named Peter Covington, who had been conducting business with Cornelius Whitmore regarding the sale of iron tools and equipment, disappeared during his overnight stay on the property. According to a letter written by Covington's business partner to the Charleston authorities, dated December 15th and preserved in municipal archives, Covington had last been seen near the slave quarters where he had reportedly made disparaging remarks about Samuel's bearing and had struck him with a riding crop for not stepping aside quickly enough. The official explanation recorded in plantation correspondence stated that Covington had departed unexpectedly before dawn, leaving no message but taking his horse and saddlebags, though the business partner's letter noted that Covington had outstanding contracts worth considerable money that made such an abrupt departure highly uncharacteristic. Dr. Silas Merchant, the physician who attended to the medical needs of several plantations in Beaufort County, kept a private journal that was discovered in 1981 among documents donated to the Medical University of South Carolina. His entry, dated December 20th, 1847, expressed his growing concern over what he termed the statistically improbable vanishing of 3 grown men from a single property within the span of 6 weeks, noting that while individual disappearances might be explained by circumstances, the emerging pattern suggested something far more disturbing was occurring at the Whitmore plantation. On the afternoon of December 28, 1847, Catherine Whitmore encountered Samuel alone in the plantation's formal gardens, a carefully maintained area behind the main house where she often walked to escape the confines of indoor life. Her diary entry from that date, preserved among the documents donated to the Charleston Historical Society, begins with a description of the unseasonably warm weather and her decision to cut fresh camellias for the dining room, but then shifts dramatically in both tone and content. Catherine recorded that Samuel was tending to the hedgerows, a task typically assigned to the more trusted house servants, and that when she approached, he did not avert his gaze or display the deferential posture expected of enslaved workers. Instead, according to her account, he spoke to her directly in English that she described as perfect and cultured, with an accent that suggested formal education rather than the pidgin speech common among field workers. The diary entry states that Samuel revealed he had been educated by Portuguese missionaries in his homeland before his capture, that he could read and write in multiple languages, and that he had been a man of considerable standing in his village. What Catherine recorded next has been the subject of much speculation among historians who have studied the document, as she wrote that Samuel then told her something that filled her with a terror she had never before experienced. But the entry ends abruptly at this point with a dramatic splatter of ink across the page, as though the pen had been dropped or thrown in haste. The diary's next entry is dated January 18th, 1848, nearly 3 weeks later, and makes no reference whatsoever to the garden encounter, instead discussing mundane household matters and social obligations in a manner that researchers have noted seems forced and deliberately evasive, suggesting that whatever Samuel revealed to Catherine had affected her profoundly enough to necessitate a complete silence on the subject. On the morning of January 24th, 1848, a group of enslaved children, ranging in age from 6 to 12 years, ventured beyond the boundaries typically permitted to them, drawn by curiosity into the restricted timber sections that had been explicitly declared off-limits to all plantation residents, except those assigned to work details. Ruth Williams provided testimony about this incident decades later to her granddaughter, an account that was recorded as part of the Works Progress Administration's Federal Writers Project interview, conducted in 1937, when Ruth was 93 years old. According to Ruth's recollection, the children returned to the quarters in a state of absolute hysteria, their clothes torn and faces streaked with tears, speaking in fragmented sentences about what they had discovered in a clearing deep within the forest. Ruth stated that the children described bones arranged in deliberate patterns on the ground, forming shapes and symbols that the older children recognized as similar to markings some of the elders had seen in their ancestral homelands before the Middle Passage. Hanging from the low branches of the trees surrounding this clearing were what the children called totems, carved wooden figures and arrangements of feathers, animal skulls, and other objects that seemed to serve some ritualistic purpose. Within hours of the children's return, Cornelius Whitmore assembled a group of men and rode into the timber section, returning before dusk with faces that Ruth described as pale and shaken. The following morning, thick black smoke could be seen rising from the forest as Cornelius ordered the entire area burned, a task that took 2 full days to complete. On January 27th, Cornelius gathered all plantation residents, both enslaved and free workers, to announce that the burned section was now permanently off-limits, and that anyone found venturing into that area would face the most severe punishment allowable under law, a threat he repeated with such vehemence that Ruth recalled the fear in his voice was as notable as the anger. In the weeks following the discovery in the woods and her mysterious encounter with Samuel in the gardens, Catherine Whitmore's behavior underwent a transformation so pronounced that it became the subject of concerned correspondence among her family and social circle. Her diary entries from February 1848 onward, preserved in the Charleston Historical Society collection, reveal a dramatic shift from the mundane observations of plantation life to cryptic passages filled with philosophical musings on justice, references to ancient practices that predated Christian civilization, and repeated mentions of debts that must inevitably be paid by those who build their prosperity upon the suffering of others. The measured, conventional tone that had characterized her earlier writings gave way to passages that historians have described as almost feverish in their intensity, with Catherine writing extensively about the concept of divine retribution and questioning whether the God worshipped in Charleston's churches was the same deity that presided over the natural world and its immutable laws. Her participation in the social obligations expected of a woman of her station ceased entirely during this period, with invitations to tea gatherings and church socials going unanswered, and her traditional monthly visits to Charleston suspended without explanation. A letter dated February 12, 1848, written by Catherine's younger sister, Margaret Ashford, to their aunt in Savannah, and discovered during a family estate sale in 1945, expressed deep concern over Catherine's deteriorating condition. Margaret wrote that Catherine had become unwell, that her letters had taken on a strange and unsettling character, and that she had urged Catherine to visit Charleston to consult with Dr. Benjamin Crawford, a physician who specialized in nervous disorders and neurasthenia affecting women of refinement. The letter noted that Catherine had refused this suggestion, stating in her reply that her mind had never been clearer and that she was finally beginning to understand truths that polite society deliberately obscured through custom and false piety. On Christmas morning, 1847, Martin Crenshaw, the overseer who had replaced Jacob Hastings less than 3 months prior, was discovered dead in his cabin by a house servant who had been sent to summon him for the holiday meal. The official coroner's report, preserved in the Beaufort County records, and dated December 26, 1847, lists the cause of death as heart failure, noting that Crenshaw was 42 years old and had complained of chest pains in the days preceding his death. The report, signed by County Coroner Dr. Edmund Fairchild, contains a brief description of the body's condition and concludes with a determination that no suspicious circumstances surrounded the death, recommending immediate burial due to the warm weather. However, a private letter, written by Dr. Fairchild to a medical colleague in Charleston, discovered in 2011 among documents purchased by a rare book dealer from an estate clearance, tells a dramatically different story. In this letter, dated January 3, 1848, Fairchild admitted that he had found unexplainable marks on Crenshaw's body, small puncture wounds along the neck and torso that suggested neither accident nor natural causes, and that the expression frozen on the dead man's face was one of absolute terror, his eyes wide and his mouth open in what appeared to be a final scream. The letter goes on to state that Dr. Fairchild had been visited by Cornelius Whitmore prior to filing his official report, and that Whitmore had made it abundantly clear that a finding of natural causes would be in everyone's best interest, implying both financial incentive and potential consequences should the coroner's curiosity lead him to more thorough investigations. Fairchild wrote to his colleague that he had agreed to falsify the report, a decision that he stated weighed heavily on his conscience, but that seemed prudent given Whitmore's influence in the county and the inexplicable nature of the wounds, which Fairchild admitted he had no medical framework to properly explain or document. Catherine Whitmore began making regular visits to the slave quarters in the weeks following Martin Crenshaw's death, a practice that was noted by multiple sources and represented a significant departure from the typical behavior of plantation mistresses of her class and era. Ruth Williams, in her 1937 Works Progress Administration interview, stated that Catherine would arrive at the quarters several times each week, carrying baskets filled with medicines, extra food rations, and clothing, distributing these items personally rather than sending them through intermediaries, as was customary. Ruth specifically recalled that Catherine seemed particularly attentive to Samuel's welfare, often engaging him in quiet conversations away from the observation of others, and ensuring that he received adequate provisions despite his isolation in the timber work assignments. Plantation account books, examined by researchers at the University of South Carolina in 1994, show unusual purchases during this period, including quantities of quinine, laudanum, and other medicinal supplies far exceeding what would be expected for routine plantation healthcare, as well as expenditures for quality fabric and preserved foods that Catherine's own household records indicate were not consumed by the Whitmore family. These documentary sources, combined with Ruth's testimony, suggest that Catherine had taken on a protective role regarding Samuel, shielding him from the suspicion that might naturally have fallen upon him given the pattern of deaths and disappearances. Perhaps most revealing is a coded letter written by Catherine on March 8, 1848, to an address in Philadelphia that would later be identified as belonging to known abolitionist sympathizers, a letter that was intercepted by federal postal inspectors and preserved in National Archives collections. The letter, written using a simple substitution cipher that was decoded during a 1972 academic study of abolitionist communication networks, speaks in metaphorical terms of a guardian angel who had appeared on her property, delivering righteous judgment upon the wicked and enacting a form of justice that human laws failed to provide, suggesting that Catherine not only understood Samuel's role in the disappearances, but had come to view his actions as morally justified. Cornelius Whitmore's business correspondence from January 1848, preserved in the South Carolina Department of Archives and History, and examined during a 1986 study of antebellum slave trade practices, reveals a series of increasingly desperate attempts to sell Samuel to buyers outside of South Carolina. A letter dated January 15th, addressed to Maxwell Thornton, owner of a large cotton plantation in Natchez, Mississippi, offers Samuel for sale at the remarkably low price of $800, less than half of what Cornelius had originally paid, and well below market value for a worker of Samuel's physical capabilities. The correspondence indicates that Thornton expressed interest and sent his agent, a professional slave appraiser named Richard Dunmore, to examine Samuel and verify his condition before finalizing the purchase. Dunmore's report, dated February 3, 1848, and discovered among Thornton's estate papers during a 2005 auction, provides a detailed assessment that ultimately recommended against the acquisition. The report notes that while Samuel possessed exceptional physical strength and appeared to be in perfect health, he demonstrated an intelligence and bearing that Dunmore described as fundamentally unsuitable for plantation labor. Writing that the subject maintains eye contact when addressed, speaks with disturbing eloquence when prompted, and carries himself with a dignity that suggests he has never been properly broken to his station. Dunmore concluded his assessment by stating that he considered Samuel potentially dangerous and advised Thornton that the reduced price likely reflected Whitmore's awareness of problems that were not immediately apparent. Following the collapse of this sale and several other similar attempts, plantation records show that Cornelius hired 4 armed guards in late February 1848, men drawn from the population of poor whites in the region who were willing to patrol the property during nighttime hours for wages that significantly impacted the plantation's operating expenses. Ruth Williams testified that these guards were specifically instructed to monitor the timber sections and report any unusual activity, and that their presence created an atmosphere of tension and fear throughout the property that persisted until the events that would finally bring the situation to its inevitable conclusion. On the evening of February 14th, 1848, Cornelius Whitmore summoned Catherine to his private study, a room located on the ground floor of the main house where he typically conducted plantation business and maintained his personal correspondence. House servants, interviewed weeks later by the magistrate investigating Cornelius's disappearance, reported hearing raised voices emanating from behind the closed study doors, with Cornelius's angry shouting audible throughout the ground floor, followed by Catherine's responses in tones they described as unnaturally calm and measured, and then a period of complete silence that lasted approximately 20 minutes before Catherine emerged alone and retired to her chambers. When dawn arrived on February 15th and Cornelius failed to appear for breakfast, a search of the house revealed that he was nowhere to be found on the property. His horse remained in the stable, but Catherine informed the household staff that her husband had left during the night, and a massive search was immediately organized, involving neighboring plantation owners, county officials, and eventually a professional tracking party brought in from Charleston. The Beaufort Gazette ran daily updates on the search for 2 weeks, with headlines expressing increasing concern over the mysterious disappearance of one of the county's most prominent citizens. Catherine's official statement to authorities, recorded in the magistrate's report, dated February 20, 1848, claimed that Cornelius had departed in the night after their discussion in the study, taking with him a significant amount of cash and important business documents, and that he had mentioned during their argument the possibility of fleeing debts that she claimed to know nothing about, suggesting financial troubles had driven him to abandon the plantation. However, plantation financial records examined by economic historians in the 1970s as part of a broader study of antebellum agricultural economics revealed that the Whitmore estate was actually quite sound financially, with profitable cotton yields, minimal outstanding debts, and substantial cash reserves documented in bank records from the First Bank of Beaufort. contradicting Catherine's explanation and raising significant questions about her truthfulness regarding the circumstances of her husband's final night at the plantation. A formal legal inquest into the disappearance of Cornelius Whitmore was convened on March 8, 1848, presided over by Magistrate William Hargrove in the Beaufort County Courthouse. Catherine Whitmore appeared as the primary witness, and the transcript of her testimony, preserved in county legal archives, reveals that she painted a picture of a husband who had become increasingly paranoid and violent in the months preceding his disappearance. She testified that Cornelius had taken to excessive drinking, that he had struck her on multiple occasions, and that he had become obsessed with perceived threats to his authority, behaviors she attributed to financial pressures and a deteriorating mental state. Several enslaved workers were brought forward to provide testimony, a highly unusual practice that reflected the lack of other witnesses available to corroborate Catherine's account. Samuel was among those who testified, speaking through an interpreter. Despite the fact that Catherine's diary had documented his perfect command of English, a discrepancy that went unremarked upon during the proceedings, the workers, including Samuel, provided consistent statements claiming that they had seen Cornelius Whitmore leaving the plantation on horseback during the early morning hours of February 15th, carrying saddlebags that appeared heavily laden. The magistrate's private notes, discovered in 1989 among documents in the family home of Hargrove's descendants, reveal a dramatically different perspective than the official record suggests. In these notes, dated March 15, 1848, Hargrove wrote that he strongly suspected foul play, noting the convenient consistency of the enslaved workers' testimonies and Catherine's remarkable composure throughout proceedings that should have been emotionally devastating. However, Hargrove also documented that he had received visits from Catherine's uncle, a prominent Charleston banker, and her brother-in-law, a state legislator, both of whom made clear their desire to see the case resolved quickly and their implicit threats regarding Hargrove's political future should he pursue investigations that might bring scandal upon their family. The notes conclude with Hargrove's admission that without physical evidence or credible witnesses willing to contradict Catherine's narrative, he had no legal basis to continue the investigation. And Samuel, despite being the most obvious suspect, was never seriously investigated or questioned beyond his brief, interpreted testimony. On April 22, 1848, Catherine Whitmore appeared before the Beaufort County Clerk to file manumission papers for 13 enslaved individuals from the Whitmore plantation, including Samuel, citing financial hardship and her inability to maintain the full workforce following her husband's disappearance and the suspension of normal plantation operations. The manumission documents, preserved in county records and examined by historians studying patterns of slave emancipation in the antebellum South, represent one of the larger single acts of liberation recorded in Beaufort County during that era, and the stated reasoning of financial difficulty was accepted without question by local authorities despite the evidence of the plantation's sound fiscal condition. According to multiple accounts, including Ruth Williams' testimony recorded during her 1937 Works Progress Administration interview, Samuel departed the plantation on the same day the manumission papers were filed, leaving behind no personal possessions and offering no indication of his intended destination to anyone except Ruth herself. Ruth stated that Samuel came to her cabin the evening before his departure and told her in his careful, educated manner that he was returning home across the ocean, that the journey would be long but that he knew the way, and that the trees and earth of the Whitmore plantation would remember what had been done there, that the land itself held memories that could never be erased, regardless of what stories white men chose to tell about the events that had transpired. Catherine Whitmore remained on the plantation for another 7 months, during which time she arranged for the sale of the property to a textile merchant from Charleston, who intended to convert the land to other agricultural purposes. By December 1848, Catherine had relocated to Boston, where city directory records from 1849 show her residing in a boarding house on Beacon Hill under her maiden name, living quietly on income from investments and maintaining no contact with her remaining family in South Carolina, a self-imposed exile that would last until her death in 1873. In the summer of 1994, a team of archaeologists from the University of South Carolina received permission to excavate portions of the former Whitmore Plantation site, which had been designated as protected wetlands following environmental legislation in the 1970s. The excavation, led by Dr. Patricia Hammond and documented in a comprehensive report published in the Journal of Southern Archaeological Studies in 1996, focused on the area that historical records indicated had been the restricted timber section, the same location where enslaved children had reported finding bones and totems in 1848. The team discovered 3 sets of human remains buried at depths suggesting deliberate interment, all belonging to adult males, all showing skeletal trauma consistent with methods of death that forensic anthropologists on the team identified as matching hunting techniques documented among certain West African tribes, specifically involving precise spinal severance and evidence of ligature marks suggesting the victims had been restrained and ritually killed. DNA testing conducted in 2008, utilizing more advanced genetic analysis techniques than had been available during the initial excavation, successfully identified one of the skeletons as belonging to Cornelius Whitmore through comparison with genetic material obtained from his documented descendants. The other 2 sets of remains, presumably those of Jacob Hastings and Martin Crenshaw, based on the historical timeline, could not be definitively identified due to the absence of surviving genetic relatives willing to provide comparison samples. Among the remains, archaeologists discovered several carved wooden objects that matched descriptions of sacred hunting totems used in spiritual practices among warrior societies in regions of West Africa, objects that would have held deep religious significance and represented a form of justice outside European legal frameworks. Catherine Whitmore's diary, donated to the Massachusetts Historical Society in 1965 by her great-great-granddaughter, contains a final entry dated November 3, 1849, written from her Boston residence. The entry, which has been widely quoted in subsequent academic studies of the case, reads in its entirety, "I sleep soundly now, knowing the hunter walks free under God's sky, and that some debts are paid in full, though never recorded in any earthly ledger.